Hello, and welcome back to my audience of humans, birds, and lizards. As promised, this week is another episode focused on world building as it relates to tabletop RPG campaigns. However, as with last week, a few of my thoughts on world building in a fiction writing context will also crop up. As noted, this is an experiment and I will consider doing more tabletop-facing content in the future if I like the results. Do let me know what you think. While I consider myself a better GM than author, I do wonder how coherent my thoughts on it are compared to fiction. Then again, what would a lizard really know about running a tabletop campaign? Now then, one of the important parts of world building is knowing when to stop. There is a writer slang term called world builder's disease, which is what happens when the theoretical author is unable to stop world building and adding more and more detail to their setting, to the point where they are unable to actually write out the story the setting is for. This is a danger mainly for writers, but it is also a danger for a GM, with some of the reasons being similar, but there are also ones unique to the GM role that don't translate exactly to the writer's experience. For writers, knowing when to stop is usually easier because there is one clear criteria for it. You stop world building when you have what you need to get the story started. Where this draws the line will differ from story to story based on its needs. If your story is heavily reliant on ocean currents and the laws of psychodynamics, then you need those laid out in detail before you can get started. In contrast, if your story just needs a bare minimum of detail on how the government of a massive continental empire works, then there's no real need for you to make a full organizational chart on who controls what and who is in charge of which office. For a GM, this idea can sound tempting, but it hits the same snag that every other GM plan in the world will run into. Your players. As the old saying goes, you can plan for 100 different actions and your players will do the 101st. The same is true of world building details. You can cover all sorts of details that have only the barest, most tangential connection to the adventure you have at hand, and your players will somehow ask you about something you never planned on or forgot to account for. So, with these details in mind, when should a GM stop world building and just get on with starting the campaign and throwing their players into the thick of things? I do not believe there is a hard and fast answer to this or a clear rule that must be followed, but I think that there are guidelines that you can use. In particular, these are the ones I use in campaign planning, though I have also used them a few times for writing. One guideline that works for me is to stop when I feel like I can already fill in the gaps on the go. This is something that I find is easier for me and other GMs who are well-read and prone to looking up various topics, because it gives us a mental stockroom of little factoids and details that we can use to help fill things in. Reaching this point is, in my opinion, something that is equal parts improvisational ability and memory, and this is a guideline that I do not recommend for newer GMs. I find that a good pre-made campaign setting will usually be designed with this sort of stopping point, whether intentionally or not. Worlds like Eberron have a great deal of detail, so you have a clear idea of what to expect in any given part of the world, but still leaves a number of critical details for you, the GM, to place as needed. You might be given the broad strokes of what law enforcement and daily life is like in Sharn, but it won't tell you where to find the best pies in the city, where adventurers can get their hands on off-market magical equipment, or which old house is probably haunted. Are there even haunted houses in Sharn? There are if your campaign needs them to exist. To help a new GM find this point easier to achieve, I recommend reading a lot. Read on topics that interest you first, and then on tangents related to them. And then branch out into topics that you think might be useful for your world. Remember as much of it as you can or keep a list of references that you can use for later. As you develop a box full of daily details about the real world, you'll find it easier to make stuff up for a fictional world of your own design. A more nebulous guideline I've used in a few instances is to stop world building when the world feels lived in. What this means will vary, though in my experience, it means that you have an idea, vague though it may be, of what life is like in that world. You know things like what people eat on a day-to-day basis, how most people look towards the typical adventuring party, what stories parents tell their children to keep them from going into the dark woods, or the burdens that come with being in charge of a kingdom. I can't really provide a strict definition of what it means for a world to be lived in. For a world to feel lived in for me, I need to be able to picture any random NPC the players interact with and follow them home, as it were. What is their life like on a day-to-day basis, when they aren't on screen and available to interact with the player characters? A world feels lived in if I can go and follow a random barmaid home and make up the important parts of her life, like where she lives, who she cares about, and how she got to where she is. A lived-in world is not dissimilar to the first guideline about being able to fill things in. For me, the difference between the two is a matter of focus. The first one is about the details of life in the world you've created. The second is focused on the people who are living those details. I feel that this is an important distinction to make when it comes to tabletop, because players that interact with the in-setting daily life may not necessarily be interested in the lives of the people in it. Or they might be more interested in the NPCs and their lives, but are less concerned about things like local laws or how the local shamanic faith conducts exorcisms. A guideline that I have rarely had occasion to run into is to stop world building when it gets in the way of the game. As a GM, you probably have some idea of where you want the game to go, or at least what situation is presented to your players. Your world design should be focused on supporting and enriching that plan, as well as having something in place for when the party wanders off and decides to interact with something else. But at the core, the world is there to support the game and nothing more. When you start putting in details that you are sure you will never need or the players will never interact with, it is time to set aside the setting document and stop. If you know your group is in the campaign for some dungeon crawling and plundering of ancient tombs, do you really need to know what King Bob's tax policy is? If the themes of the campaign are about intrigue and deception, of the intricate web of political maneuvering that goes on in the court of the shogun, does it really matter what those mysterious ruins to the north are? This does not mean you don't ever need to fill in those details. King Bob might have a law that taxes all profits gained from adventuring, and the party could get in trouble for tax evasion if they don't pay up. A party of samurai might venture into those northern ruins to recover an artifact from an ancient dynasty to gain favor with the shogun. But these are instances when the details become relevant to your campaign. If they aren't relevant to your basic idea and the players don't seem inclined to interact with them, then filling them in just gets in the way. A related situation is if you find that you are no longer able to plan the campaign to your satisfaction because there are world details that get in the way. Too much of the world being set in stone robs you of the ability to improvise, which is a critical skill for any GM. Yes, a detailed world is good and can add immersion to even the most basic murder hobo campaign, but putting in too much detail can stifle you. Leave yourself room to maneuver if you need it, rather than placing roadblocks in front of yourself. The final guideline for when to stop world building is when you have enough for your group to sink their teeth into, and no more. I think the most GM relevant guideline, but also one that is most dependent on the GM knowing their group, is this. Some groups will enjoy reading a world building document so they can really get into the mindset of life in that world and make characters that fit. Other groups will balk if they have to read more than one page of setting information just to understand how things work in your world. Different groups, different limits. This one, I hope, is obvious. You stop when you have all the world building material that your group would be willing to learn before jumping in. They will probably have questions that you will need to have answers to as they make characters or play the game, and that's fine. But for a GM that knows their group well, I do not think they need to build a setting and populate it with details any more than the players are willing to interact with at the onset. You can add more to it later, whether on-screen through the campaign or off-screen during your preparations. The challenge here is finding a balance if your group is a mixed lot, in terms of campaign setting buy-in. You might have a player who will only ever tolerate 1 or 2 pages, while another would happily go through a 10-page document or longer. In my experience, the easiest way to balance the expectations and needs of these two groups is to have a quick and concise introduction document that condenses key information into an easily digestible form, while keeping a more detailed one ready to be handed out as reference if asked. And that will be all for this week. Hopefully you got something useful out of this, but if all you did was stay long enough to hear me finish rambling, that's good too. Please like and subscribe if you enjoyed this, and pass the link around if you have anyone you know who might be interested in this content. As always, keep rolling.